Good morning. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wellness Wednesday. I hope you are having a fabulous morning. I am. I love spring. And I know that technically it feels like summer here in Florida, but there are so many baby everythings everywhere. And I just saw a fledgling cardinal getting fed this morning on the deck by mama, and it just made my morning already. So, I just love it. So anyway, if you're here, let me know you're here. If you don't see this till afterwards, hit hashtag replay in the comments or ask a question, drop a comment, whatever. We just ask that you keep it positive because we do try to do that as much as possible. If you are just stumbling on my page, my name is Donna. I'm a mom, a nana, a girlfriend, a jazzerciser, runner, wellness advocate. I'm a grad school studying for my Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling. And I own an activewear boutique that I just love, that just gives me a little extra joy all the time. So if you have followed me for a while, you know that last year I did a video on misunderstood mental health conditions. And by popular request, I'm expanding on that video over these next few weeks because there were several that I mentioned. Good morning, Victoria. There were several that I mentioned. So a little tiny bit of a deeper dive. Still, these are things that we could talk about for days. And I just want to be clear that the things I'm talking about, when they're often used casually and out of context, when we name these disorders, and that really adds to the stigma. They're not buzzwords. They may seem like buzzwords right now, but they're not buzzwords. They're real things. And the more we know, the more we can recognize real mental health conditions and act accordingly. Not only that, but the more we know, the less likely we are to use terms casually that we just don't really necessarily understand, or maybe that we do understand with a little bit more knowledge, and realize that using it casually only adds to that stigma. So remember, again, I'm studying for my Master of Science, but I'm not a counselor yet. And so I just want to remind you that the purpose of this mini-series is awareness, but not diagnosis. We're looking to understand real conditions and not label people. So that's the purpose. Awareness, not diagnosis. And understanding instead of labeling. So I hope you enjoyed last week's video. If you follow me regularly on disordered eating, I will drop the link to that in the comments when I'm done in case you missed it. But let's get started. Today we're going to talk about PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. In case you didn't know, most people do. And I'm going to start with some misconceptions versus reality. In fact, this actually brought to mind, getting ready for today, actually brought to mind something I saw a few days ago. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. That's not just PTSD specific. So common myths or misconceptions versus reality of PTSD, is that one misconception is that only soldiers get PTSD, which is absolutely not true. The reality is that it can affect anyone who has experienced or witnessed trauma, including abuse, accidents, natural disasters, medical trauma, bullying, anything of the like. And remember that everybody has what we view as trauma may not be what somebody else experiences as trauma. Everybody's got their different thresholds. Other things that okay, this is gonna be one of those days. Other people that are subject to PTSD are first responders and frontline trauma responses. And sometimes this looks like vicarious trauma. When people are on the front lines and they're responding to critical emergencies, sometimes it's just like the exposure to violence or witnessing trauma. Sometimes they're part of that issue, and they experience PTSD as a result. And sometimes it's vicarious trauma. Even counselors can experience vicarious trauma working with people who are experiencing PTSD as they work through their issue. And sudden loss can cause PTSD. So, but the fact of the matter is that civilians represent the majority of the PTSD diagnosis. So it is a misconception or a myth that only soldiers get PTSD, because it can affect anyone who's experienced or witnessed these things. Another misconception is that people with PTSD are violent or dangerous. Absolutely not true. Some people experience irritability. Wow. It's going to be one of those mornings, y'all. Experience irritability or anger as a symptom, but the majority of them are not violent. And this stigma contributes to the shame that prevents people from seeking help when they need it. Another misconception is that PTSD happens right after the traumatic event. Again, absolutely not true. Symptoms can take weeks, months, or even years to show up. And delayed onset is especially common in people who tend to suppress or minimize what has happened. And we've heard stories like this before, of women who have experienced rape. And again, you know, maybe I should have done a trigger warning at the beginning of this. At the beginning of this video, some of the content matter. I'm going to try to stay general, but some of it may be a little bit, you know, upsetting. But women who have experienced that have often been known to minimize it, blame it on themselves, make it so that they believe in their own head that it's their fault, that it didn't really happen, and that can sometimes delay onset of PTSD symptoms. So that's what I mean when I say the people that suppress or minimize what has happened for fear or shame or whatever their perception of is that they should have done differently to keep it from happening. And then another one that's a big one for me on the misconception, and I'm gonna touch on something else here for a minute that I mentioned a minute ago, is that a common misconception of PTSD is they look okay, so they must be fine. And like other mental health disorders, PTSD is often invisible, meaning we don't see it. And that's part of the stigma behind mental health, because if you have a broken arm, we can see that. We know you have a broken arm. But if there's something broken in our brains, that's not always visible. And so it makes it harder to believe in it, to give it life, if that makes sense. So PTSD is often invisible, as are other mental health illnesses. And many people with PTSD are very high functioning, just like people with anxiety and depression. But they silently battle flashbacks, avoidance, hypervigilance, nightmares, and various other things that we don't ever see, but they are very, very real on their end. So a few days ago, I saw a post that kind of tore someone apart. It was a picture of a vehicle in a handicapped parking spot, and it kind of tore somebody apart for parking in that spot because they were not visibly handicapped. And this has been a subject that I've seen very much of. Every once in a while, somebody posts something on Facebook or on social media and makes comments about how this person didn't look like they belonged in the handicapped spot. And here's the thing. There's a lot of different things out there that can cause someone to need a handicapped spot that we don't see. And this goes back to the very old adage that our mothers told us, our grandparents told us, which is not to judge a book by its cover, because there are, especially with mental health disorders, there are so many things that we cannot see. And even with physical illnesses, there are physical illnesses that we don't necessarily see in the 5 minutes it takes for somebody to make it from the parking lot into a store or vice versa. So it's really, really, this is part of why I'm doing this mini series, is because it is so important to loosen up those misconceptions and to understand there's reality behind these disorders. And that, again, part of the problem with the mental health stigma is that not all of these are visible, just like some physical illnesses are not visible. The Winn-Dixie in my neighborhood used to have pregnant woman parking spots. If you're pregnant, you're pregnant. You might be 3 months pregnant and not look it, but you still can use that parking spot. And again, the point here is that we can't make assumptions based on how someone looks. I mentioned this last week when we were talking about eating disorders. We can't make assumptions based on how somebody looks, because we don't know. We don't know what they're dealing with on the inside. So this is kind of a big deal, and it kind of reinforces for me, that post reinforced for me why I'm doing this mini series, to do a little bit deeper dive into each of these disorders that is thrown around so casually in conversation anymore. So, and sometimes it's almost cool to say we have them or we're experiencing something when we're not. And and it minimizes the experience for the people that really are suffering. So here's some nerd facts just to lighten it back up a little bit. Here's some nerd facts about PTSD. 1 in 13 people will develop PTSD at some point in their life. Women are twice as likely as men to develop it. And again, I will disclaimer that always with, is it really that women are more likely to develop it, or is it more likely that men are less likely to report it? Because again, in our culture, we have always emphasized the strong man doesn't say anything, he doesn't cry, he doesn't he doesn't feel anything, basically. So I feel like in a lot of these cases, when they say women are twice as likely to develop it, that a lot of that's due to underreporting more than anything. So among U.S. combat veterans, and the timing of this was funny with Memorial Day having just been on Monday. Among U.S. combat veterans, 11 to 20% experience PTSD in any given year. However, that's still only a tiny piece of the total. A lot of times when we hear the term PTSD, we assume military service. And that's not the case as much as 80% of the time, possibly 90% of the time. So the combat veteran experience of PTSD is only a tiny piece of the total experience. And that's part of the stereotype. And we even sometimes tend to get mad when somebody who we know has not been in military service claims to have PTSD, because we're like, you can't have that. You haven't served. And that's another misconception that's completely not true. So children and teens can and do experience PTSD each year. But again, that's especially after abuse, loss, or exposure to violence. And with kids, a lot of times that's where you're going to see a delayed onset, because there's a fear response. You know, if they've witnessed violence or experienced violence, they may be afraid to talk about it. They may have been told not to talk about it. So a lot of times that's where, especially with kids, where you see those symptoms are not going to really develop for a very long time. And a lot of times that might look like, you know, they're acting out or bad behavior that we blame on something else when it's actually a PTSD response. And PTSD is not just a memory problem. It is a memory processing and threat detection problem. The brain, our brains, we've talked about this before, how our brains are constantly trying to protect us, but they're doing so from a very unevolved state, if that makes sense, and from a very primal state. So in PTSD, it's more of a hypervigilance, like take that brain trying to protect you and multiply it by 100 times. And it's more of a hypervigilant, constant state where the brain's still trying to protect the person, even long after the danger has passed. And then the final nerd fact is that people with PTSD are more likely to have comorbidities with their PTSD, which means depression, anxiety, substance abuse. Those things are more likely to be co-occurring. People with PTSD are more likely to have difficulty with daily function than the average person, with employment and with relationships. They're also more likely to be misdiagnosed, which I kind of touched on just a minute ago, talking about kids with their delayed onset. They're acting out behavior, restlessness, things like that, that could in fact be a PTSD response, might be interpreted as ADHD. Or some type of other disruptive disorder when it's actually a stress response. So when it comes to breaking the stigma and stereotype of PTSD, the bottom line is that the soldier in battle is a very valid story and may be the reason why PTSD was first discovered and named and explored. However, it is not the only story, and I actually have a few stories here. They're made up based on true people and true events, but if you followed me for any length of time, you know I don't like to mention people or say things in such a way that anybody could actually figure out who I'm talking about. And most of the time, you probably wouldn't know who I'm talking about. So again, the soldier in battle is a very valid story, but it's not the only one. Real life experiences that I have personally witnessed, and I can't tell you for sure that I've experienced PTSD. It's entirely possible. But mostly I've just lived with anxiety and depression and some severe social anxiety for a short time. So what I do know is that the people here in my area, and we were hit with a couple of storms very, very close together, and the damage was incredible. And I don't mean that in a good way. It was incredibly bad. And that was on the heels of a couple of different types of storms in a previous year or two, tornadoes, hurricanes, flooding. This area is prone to flooding. While we tend to not sustain the brunt of damage from a hurricane where we are, we are very prone to flooding, and that flooding can be very significant. A lot of people lost their homes and then had to turn around and prepare for another storm, or lost their homes, or were displaced from their homes for a long period of time, and then had to turn around and try to prepare for another storm. PTSD can happen in these experiences where the hypervigilance begins to look like, and I have some notes here, it begins to look like hypervigilance, that every time there's a strong wind, they're like, oh my gosh, I have to go do this and I have to go do that. And they begin obsessively checking supplies and things like that nature. So that's a real experience that people have in response to natural disasters. I have a friend who in high school was in a car accident, and in that car accident, their passenger did not survive. And that friend has since, and it's been many, many years, that friend has since reached a point, and it could be called selective mutism. I don't know if that's ever actually been diagnosed, but has reached a point where when it comes to anything medical, they have a very difficult time. They cannot go to the front half of a church during a funeral service. They cannot go into a hospital. It is very difficult. They become unable to talk. And this is a very, very long-term response to something that happened when they were very young. And that's a real life PTSD experience that's not military or battle related. That is an example of what a loss compounded with a traumatic event can do to someone over time. They have a very difficult time. They can only talk about medical issues by text, and even that gets iffy. You can't, if there's something medical going on, something serious health-wise going on, you can't talk to them in person or on the phone for a while after, they've kind of desensitized to it. And that is, in fact, a PTSD response. Some other examples are, I already talked about a car accident. Other examples are medical trauma, such as complications during birth, delivery, that becomes fear of the hospital setting, and it involves nightmares and things like that. And a lot of times those things are written off to postpartum depression. And then there's abuse. Abuse is probably one of the biggest perpetrators of PTSD outside of the battlefield. And that can look like sexual abuse. That can look like physical abuse. It can look like childhood abuse, mental, emotional abuse. And an example is a young man who grew up with a parent who was that parent constantly yelled, shamed, and belittled him. And we've heard stories like this before all of the time, right? We just may not have realized it was PTSD. And he learned to shrink himself to stay safe. So as an adult, anytime anybody had loud arguments or raised their voices, even in movies, it caused him to disassociate and panic. He thought he was just too sensitive. That's what other people told him because they didn't understand, until he started to go to a support group that helped him understand that his childhood trauma shaped his brain and nervous system. What they call battered wife syndrome is a PTSD response that becomes more of a survival mechanism in the situation, and then looks a little bit more like PTSD once that person is out of that situation. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So what does PTSD look like? PTSD can look like flashbacks, nightmares, feeling jumpy or on edge all of the time, avoidance of certain situations, people, things, you know what I mean? Or types of situations, types of things that might be loosely associated with whatever the trauma was. You might avoid people who look a certain way because your trauma was related to somebody that looked like that. Emotional numbness or shame, trouble sleeping or concentrating, emotional outbursts or irritability, and physical symptoms. It can look like somatic symptoms too. Good morning, Miss Ann. Like stomach pain or fatigue. And sometimes it doesn't look like anything on the outside, like we just talked about with the whole handicap parking issue. Sometimes PTSD doesn't look like anything because it lingers quietly for years. And those symptoms come out looking like anxiety, anger issues, avoidance, overreaction, like I said, overreaction to minor things. Again, avoidance of situations, people, or things that look like situations or people that those traumatic events are associated with. Like y'all, I had a couple of nasty car accidents in a row back in 2001. Both of them involved silver cars. I always wanted a silver car. I will absolutely not purchase a silver car. Would I call that a PTSD response? No, but it's the best layman's example I've got of avoidance of something due to an experience. There may have been some short-term response going on there after the first accident because I was terrified to get back in a vehicle. It took me a while. I was a very jumpy driver for a while, which probably didn't do anybody any favors. But again, PTSD doesn't necessarily look like what we think. And that trauma can linger quietly for years. And those symptoms can come out looking like something different. Anxiety, anger, avoidance, overreaction. So they can actually be an anxiety disorder like I described a couple weeks ago, or they could actually be a PTSD response that has evolved slowly over time. And what it doesn't look like is being dramatic or being stuck in the past. These I have in quotes because these are things that people say. You're just being dramatic. You're just stuck in the past. You need to let it go. You need to get over it. And that's not helpful because we don't know what's really going on inside that person's brain and what their level of tolerance is for trauma. So again, all these things may be trauma responses and we don't know because again, we think they're being over dramatic or they're trying to seek attention. Another common one is you don't look like someone with PTSD. What does that look like? What does that look like? There is not a look, and this type of thing, this type of phrasing and this type of talk contributes to invisibility and the disbelief that many survivors experience when they are suffering from a PTSD response. And a lot of times, again, the looking for attention. It could simply be that they are trying to communicate something that they haven't figured out how to articulate or that they can't say out loud. Like in the example of my friend who becomes very awkward surrounding anything having to do with any kind of medical illness, hospital, anything like that. That person can't articulate how they're feeling. What we see is that they won't go visit a relative in the hospital or that they won't come up past the back row at a funeral service or a celebration of life, or they may not even go even if it was somebody close to them, or that you may be contacting them about something that's going on with you, and all of a sudden they're just not there on the other end because they can't talk about it. So it doesn't look like anything, and they're not looking for attention. Lots of different people, probably that we encounter on a daily basis, experience PTSD, and we never see it because A, they're battling it silently for pride or because they don't want, or shame or whatever, and B, because it just doesn't always have to look like something. It doesn't, just like some physical illnesses don't have to look like something. They're not always visible on the outside. Neither are disorders like PTSD. So I would encourage you to show compassion instead of saying things like, that gave me PTSD. If you had a sudden everyday stressor that kind of shook you up a little bit. This is something I hear a lot. And I can honestly say I don't think I've ever used it. Possibly because I've never really associated PTSD with myself, or I might have been just as guilty. Lord knows I have used some of these terms that I talk about in these Wellness Wednesdays in casual use, not even thinking about it. But to say that gave me PTSD when it wasn't to describe an everyday stressor instead of something like that really shook me up, or whoa, that really caught me off guard. Those kind of things, the language matters, y'all. And those kind of things really do minimize the experiences of people that do deal with PTSD or any kind of invisible disorder. Whether it's medical, whether it's mental, it doesn't matter. So I encourage you to, and I challenge you to show compassion in these situations, to say things like, I believe you, or you are not alone, or not say anything and just listen and be empathetic. Or say it's okay to need help, and reassure them that it's okay to need help, because a lot of times the hesitancy to get help comes from a place of shame. It comes from a place of embarrassment. It comes from a perception that they are weak for having this response because somebody else went through the same thing and didn't respond this way. So it's important that we show compassion through our language, and try to remember that nobody looks like anything. Okay, yes, a 9-month pregnant woman looks 9 months pregnant, but a 3-month pregnant woman, sometimes even a 6-month pregnant woman, might not. So just like anything else, not all things are visible, and it's not compassionate for us, and it's not good for those people that are experiencing the mental health disorder or the physical illness or whatever, for us to make assumptions based on their appearance. So at this point, I'm going to wrap up now. Like I said, there's a lot we could dig into about PTSD. But this is, again, for awareness, not diagnosis. I'm not going to get into the laundry list of symptoms. We kind of covered some of that. And this is about understanding real conditions and not labeling more than anything. So some reminders that I'll close with are that words can harm or heal. You pick. We pick. When we choose compassion over labels and curiosity over judgment, we create a better space for the people that are navigating PTSD or other invisible conditions, period. If this is something you're experiencing, if you're concerned that you might have PTSD because you've experienced a trauma, and some of what I listed off about what it could look like kind of resonated with you, it's okay to seek support. It is okay to seek support. There's a lot of very interesting treatments out there that are newer, pertaining to PTSD. And one of them is EMDR, and I'm trying to find my notes on that. One of them is where's it at? I can't find it, but EMDR, which is eye movement I can't, you would think I would remember this better. Where's it at? Hang on, guys. I know I have some notes here about current treatments I wasn't necessarily going to get into. And now I can't find them. But EMDR, I'm struggling to remember the acronym, but it's eye movement something. I'll drop it in the comments. Has shown a lot of promise with those experiencing PTSD, is worth checking into. But again, words can harm or heal. So when we choose compassion over labels, and we choose curiosity over judgment, and we choose to maybe not speak, thank you, Miss Ann, you too, to maybe not speak on things that we don't know enough about, then again, we can create a better space for people that are navigating this. Seek support. There's therapy available out there that works, and it's okay to do that. There are support groups, and you may need medical care, and that's okay too. As I said last week and probably the week before, if you can go to the doctor for a broken arm, you can go to the doctor for a broken brain. There certainly should be no shame in this. And most importantly, you are not alone. Healing is possible. And through more compassionate language, we can make that more possible, or seem more possible, for everyone. So that's all I have for today on PTSD. Next week, we are going to talk about the differences between OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Totally not the same thing. We'll talk about that more next week. In the meantime, if you found this helpful, please share it. If you think it'll help someone else, drop a comment, a question. And in the meantime, between now and when I see you next week, have an awesome Wednesday. And most importantly, be well. Bye.